The loneliness of healing. Why no one understands your journey. Have you ever tried to explain what you're going through to someone you love, only to watch their eyes glaze over with polite concern? You search for words to describe the earthquake happening inside you, the complete reconstruction of everything you thought you knew about yourself, and all you can manage is "I'm just going through something." They nod. They offer advice about exercise, positive thinking, maybe a vacation. And you smile, because how do you tell them that you're not sad, you're not broken, you're not having a crisis? You're waking up. How do you describe the strange grief of outgrowing your own life? Here's the paradox nobody tells you about healing. The deeper you go into your own transformation, the more isolated you become from the very people you want to share it with. The hero's journey isn't just about slaying dragons and finding treasure. It's about returning to your village fundamentally changed, carrying wisdom that has no language, only to discover that everyone else is still speaking the dialect of your former self. They want the old you back. They need the old you back. Because your transformation holds up a mirror to their own unlived potential, their own unconscious fears, their own carefully constructed defenses. Your healing becomes a threat, your growth becomes a betrayal, and suddenly you're standing alone on a shore you can barely describe, watching the familiar world across water that only you can see. This is the loneliness of healing, not the loneliness of being abandoned, but the loneliness of becoming. And it may be the most profound, necessary, and misunderstood aspect of the individuation process that Jung ever described. Let me tell you about Sarah. She's not a real person, but she represents a real pattern, one you might recognize. For 30 years, Sarah was the glue, the peacemaker in her family, the reliable friend everyone called in crisis. The employee who stayed late, the partner who compromised, the daughter who didn't cause trouble. She built her entire identity around being needed, around being good, around making sure everyone else was comfortable. And then one day, after yet another conversation where she swallowed her true feelings to keep the peace, something inside her cracked. Not broke, cracked like an egg, and something raw and real began to emerge. Sarah started therapy. She began reading about codependency, about people pleasing, about the false self. She started saying no. She started asking for what she needed. She started setting boundaries, and here's what nobody prepared her for. The people in her life didn't celebrate her growth. They resented it. Her mother accused her of being selfish. Her friends stopped calling. Her partner said she'd changed, and not in a good way. The very behaviors that were making her healthier, more authentic, more whole, were making her relationships implode. So Sarah found herself in this excruciating position. Do I continue growing and risk losing everyone, or do I shrink back into the comfortable cage I've outgrown? She tried to explain what she was learning, tried to share the insights that were liberating her, but her words landed like foreign currency. Her mother couldn't hear it because Sarah's healing meant confronting her own maternal wounds. Her friends couldn't hear it because Sarah's boundaries meant they'd have to take responsibility for their own emotional needs. Her partner couldn't hear it because Sarah's authenticity meant the entire dynamic of their relationship had to transform or end. This is the first mystery of healing. Why does getting healthier sometimes mean getting lonelier? Here's another pattern you might recognize. Michael spent 2 years in deep inner work after a breakdown that looked like success from the outside. Prestigious job, beautiful family, respected in his community, but inside he was dying. The persona he'd constructed, the mask of the successful man, had become a prison. When it finally collapsed, he entered what John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. He emerged transformed, more present, more real, more alive. But when he tried to return to his old social circles, he felt like an anthropologist observing an alien culture. The conversations that once engaged him now felt hollow. The achievements that once motivated him now seemed empty. The values his community celebrated now appeared to him as elegant defenses against authentic living. Michael wasn't judging anyone. He was simply operating from a different level of consciousness, and there was no bridge back. His healing had taken him somewhere his tribe couldn't follow, and the isolation was crushing, not because he was alone, but because he was surrounded by people who knew his name but couldn't recognize who he'd become. This is what conventional wisdom about healing gets catastrophically wrong. We're told that getting healthy means reconnecting, building community, strengthening relationships. And while that's true in the long term, it completely ignores the necessary phase of profound alienation that accompanies real transformation. The caterpillar doesn't maintain friendships with other caterpillars while it's dissolving in the cocoon. The seed doesn't stay connected to other seeds while it's dying into the tree. Metamorphosis requires a kind of death, and death is a solitary affair. We live in a culture that pathologizes aloneness, that treats solitude as something to be fixed. We're given mantras about connection and community, told that isolation is the real danger. But what if there's a difference between the loneliness of disconnection and the loneliness of transformation? What if some loneliness is not a symptom of sickness, but a sign of growth? What if the very isolation we're taught to fear is actually a necessary crucible for becoming real? The surface-level understanding is that healing means feeling better, getting along with people, returning to normal. But what happens when you realize there is no normal to return to? What happens when the healing reveals that normal was the problem all along? What happens when you discover that the life you so carefully constructed was built on foundations of fear, conditioning, and unconscious patterns that no longer serve you? The prescription for connection and community assumes you have a self to connect with others. But what if you're in the process of discovering that you never had a self to begin with, only a collection of other people's expectations wearing your face? This is where the real loneliness begins, not in the absence of people, but in the presence of a truth that has no witnesses. Carl Jung understood something that most therapeutic approaches miss entirely. Individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, is fundamentally a lonely journey. Not because it has to be, but because it requires you to differentiate yourself from the collective, to separate your own voice from the chorus of voices that have been speaking through you since childhood. And the collective, Jung observed, does not celebrate individuals who separate from it. The collective wants conformity, comfort, predictability. Your healing disrupts all three. Jung wrote, "The psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate." But what he didn't emphasize enough for modern readers is what happens when you do make the inner situation conscious. You become, in a very real sense, an exile from consensus reality. You've seen behind the curtain. You've recognized the machinery of the psyche. You understand the games people play, the defenses they employ, the shadows they project. And this knowledge creates an unbridgeable gap between you and those still sleepwalking through their lives. Let's talk about the shadow. In Jungian psychology, the shadow contains all the aspects of ourselves we've deemed unacceptable and pushed into the unconscious. The anger we were told was ugly, the neediness we learned was weak, the wildness we were taught was dangerous, the selfishness we believed was evil. For decades, we exile these parts of ourselves to maintain our persona, the mask we show the world, the acceptable version of ourselves we've constructed to earn love, belonging, and safety. But here's what happens during deep healing. You begin shadow work. You start retrieving these exiled parts. You begin to integrate the anger, the neediness, the wildness, the self-interest. And as you do, you become more whole, more complex, more real. But you also become less predictable, less manageable, less willing to play the roles others need you to play. The people in your life who benefited from your shadow being unconscious, who needed you to stay small, accommodating, self-sacrificing, suddenly find themselves dealing with someone they don't recognize. Your mother needed you to carry her unexpressed anger so she could remain the good woman. Your partner needed you to carry their rejected vulnerability so they could remain strong. Your friends needed you to remain insecure so they could feel superior. Your employer needed you to remain ambitious so they could exploit your drive. None of this was conscious. These are unconscious contracts, psychological arrangements that serve the collective but sacrifice the individual. And when you begin to break these contracts by integrating your shadow, the collective experiences it as a betrayal. This is why healing is lonely. You're not just changing yourself. You're changing the entire psychological ecosystem you've been part of. You're disrupting the unconscious agreements that kept the system stable, and the system will push back. The system will try to pull you back into your old role. The system will punish you for growing, not out of malice, but out of the natural resistance any system has to change. Jung called the process of becoming your authentic self individuation. It's the central task of the second half of life, the journey from living according to collective values to living according to your own deep truth. But Jung was also clear that this journey requires what he called the pain of separation from the collective. You cannot individuate and remain fully embedded in the collective consciousness. You cannot become yourself and still be everyone's idea of who you should be. These are mutually exclusive paths. What Jung called the persona is the social mask, the adapted self, the version of you that learned to survive in your family, your culture, your specific circumstances. The persona is not false exactly. It served a purpose. It got you here. But it's not the totality of who you are. Behind the persona is the self, capitalized in Jungian terms, the center of your totality, the archetype of wholeness. Individuation is the process of shifting your center of identity from persona to self, from the adapted self to the authentic self. And this shift necessarily creates distance between you and those who only knew your persona. Imagine you've been playing a character in a play for 30 years. Everyone knows this character. Everyone relates to this character. The character has lines, motivations, predictable responses. And then one day you step out of character. You speak your own words. You express your own needs. You follow your own impulses. The other actors don't know what to do. The script doesn't work anymore. The play can't continue. This is what it feels like to move from persona to self. You're no longer playing the assigned role, and everyone who cast you in that role experiences your authenticity as chaos. Jung also spoke of enantiodromia, the principle that everything eventually becomes its opposite. The person who was always strong eventually must find their softness. The person who was always accommodating eventually must find their assertiveness. The person who was always rational eventually must find their emotionality. This principle of compensation, of balancing the psyche, means that real healing often looks like becoming someone completely different. And this transformation terrifies the people who need you to stay the same. The collective unconscious, that shared reservoir of human experience and archetypal patterns, contains the blueprint for individuation. Deep in the psyche, beyond personal history, beyond cultural conditioning, there's a knowing about wholeness, about integration, about the journey toward becoming real. When you begin deep healing, you're not just working with your personal unconscious. You're tapping into this deeper current, this archetypal pattern of death and rebirth, of descent and return, of dissolution and reconstitution. You're living out the hero's journey, the night sea journey, the dark night of the soul. These are not metaphors. They're maps of the territory you're actually traversing. And these journeys, across all cultures and all times, have always been depicted as lonely. The hero always goes alone into the dark forest. The initiate always enters the cave by themselves. The shaman always makes the journey to the underworld in solitude. This loneliness is not incidental to the transformation. It's essential to it. The existential philosophers understood this loneliness from a different angle. Kierkegaard wrote about the leap of faith, but what he was really describing was the radical responsibility of becoming an individual. He argued that most people live in what he called the aesthetic or ethical stages, following pleasure or following rules, but always following something external. The authentic life, what he called the religious stage, requires you to stand alone before existence, to make choices that cannot be justified to others, to live from an internal authority that has no external validation. This is why Kierkegaard said, "The crowd is untruth," not because people in groups are lying, but because truth, real existential truth, can only be found in the solitude of individual existence. When you begin to live authentically, when you begin to make choices based on your own deep knowing rather than collective approval, you necessarily separate yourself from the crowd. And this separation feels like loneliness because it is loneliness, but it's the loneliness of being real rather than the loneliness of being unknown. Nietzsche took this even further with his concept of the Übermensch, the person who creates their own values rather than inheriting them from the herd. Nietzsche understood that real transformation requires what he called the revaluation of all values. Everything you were taught about good and bad, right and wrong, success and failure, must be questioned, deconstructed, and rebuilt according to your own examined experience. This process is not just intellectually challenging, it's socially isolating, because once you stop accepting conventional morality at face value, once you start creating your own meaning, you become incomprehensible to those still operating within the inherited framework. Nietzsche wrote, "One must still have chaos in oneself to give birth to a dancing star." The healing journey requires you to enter chaos, to let your old structures dissolve, to sit in the uncertainty and confusion of not knowing who you are. This is terrifying enough on its own, but it's exponentially more terrifying when everyone around you is demanding that you stabilize, that you return to normal, that you be the person they need you to be. The pressure to abort the transformation, to return to the familiar, is immense, and resisting this pressure requires a kind of courage that can only be mustered in solitude. Eastern philosophy offers yet another perspective. The Buddhist concept of enlightenment involves the dissolution of the ego, the recognition that the separate self is an illusion. But here's the paradox. To dissolve the false self, you first have to develop a strong enough sense of self to withstand the dissolution. You have to individuate before you can transcend individuation. You have to become someone before you can realize you're no one. And this process of becoming requires separation from the collective, requires the development of what Buddhism calls right understanding, a seeing through of the conventional reality that everyone around you still accepts as absolute truth. The Tao Te Ching speaks of the sage as someone who is in the world but not of it, someone who moves through society without being defined by it. This is the end point of the healing journey, not isolation for its own sake, but a kind of sovereign solitude that allows for connection without dependence, engagement without identification, love without fusion. But to get there, you must first pass through the loneliness of differentiation, the necessary separation that allows you to discover where you end and others begin. There's a concept in philosophy called bad faith, articulated by Sartre. It refers to the lies we tell ourselves to avoid the anxiety of freedom, the ways we pretend we have no choice in order to escape responsibility for our lives. Most people live in bad faith most of the time. They blame their parents, their circumstances, their trauma, their biology, anything to avoid the terrifying recognition that they are radically free to create their own meaning. When you begin healing, when you begin taking responsibility for your own psychological patterns, when you stop blaming and start creating, you exit bad faith. You enter authenticity, but this means you can no longer bond with others over shared victimhood, shared complaints, shared excuses. The common currency of most human connection is commiseration. When you stop commiserating, when you start living as if you're free, people don't know how to relate to you anymore. Here's another layer, the philosophical problem of other minds. How do I know that your experience of reality matches mine? How do I know that the word red points to the same experience for you as it does for me? How do I know that your pain feels like my pain, that your joy feels like my joy? I can never fully know. There's an irreducible gap between your consciousness and mine. We're all, in a profound sense, trapped in the prison of subjective experience, only able to guess at what it's like to be someone else. Most of the time, we paper over this gap with language, with assumptions, with projections. But when you're in deep healing, when you're having experiences that fundamentally alter your perception of reality itself, this gap becomes a chasm. You're having experiences that have no precedent in your previous life, experiences that are difficult to articulate even to yourself, let alone to someone who hasn't been where you've been. And the attempt to bridge this gap, to make others understand, becomes exhausting. Eventually, you stop trying. Not because you don't care, but because you realize that some experiences can only be understood by living them. The ancient mystery schools understood this. That's why they had levels of initiation. You couldn't explain the higher mysteries to the uninitiated, because they didn't have the perceptual apparatus to understand them. First, you had to be initiated, transformed, given new eyes. Only then could the teaching be transmitted. Healing is a kind of initiation. It gives you new eyes. But unlike the ancient mystery schools, we don't live in a culture that recognizes or honors this process. We live in a culture that wants immediate understanding, that resists hierarchy of experience, that insists everyone's perspective is equally valid. But this is a comforting lie. Some perspectives are earned through suffering, through transformation, through the willingness to dissolve and be reconstituted. And those perspectives cannot be translated into the language of those who haven't made the journey. So what does this actually look like in everyday life? How does this loneliness of healing manifest when you're just trying to make it through Tuesday? You might notice that conversations that used to feel connecting now feel hollow. Your friend complains about their mother for the 100th time, and instead of joining in the familiar dance of validation and commiseration, you see the pattern. You see how they're using the complaint to avoid taking responsibility for their own choices. You see how the narrative they're telling themselves keeps them stuck. And you can't unhear it. You can't unsee it. You want to share what you're seeing, but you know from experience that it won't land. They're not ready. and that's okay, but it means you're sitting across from someone you love, feeling utterly alone. Or you're at a family dinner, and the same dynamics are playing out that have been playing out for decades. Your father makes a passive-aggressive comment. Your mother plays the victim. Your sibling deflects with humor. And you, in the past, would have played your assigned role in this dance. But now you see it. You see the whole system, the way each person's behavior triggers the next, the way everyone is unconsciously colluding to maintain the dysfunctional equilibrium. And you don't want to play anymore, so you stay quiet, or you respond differently, and the whole family turns on you. What's wrong with you? Why are you being so sensitive? You've changed. Yes, you have. And the family system is trying to pull you back into your old role, because your new presence destabilizes the entire structure. This shows up at work too. You used to bond with colleagues over complaints about the boss, about the stupid policies, about how unfair everything is. But now you see how this bonding over shared negativity is actually keeping everyone stuck, is creating a culture of victimhood that prevents real problem solving or growth. You try to shift the conversation toward solutions, toward taking responsibility, toward what's actually within your control. And suddenly, you're no longer part of the in-group. You're the buzzkill, the one who doesn't get it, the one who's changed. The first step in navigating this loneliness is recognizing that it's not a sign that something's wrong with you or your healing process. It's a sign that something's right. It's a sign that you're actually transforming, not just performing transformation. Real change creates friction. If your healing isn't creating some discomfort in your relationships, you might want to question whether you're actually healing or just rearranging the furniture in the same room. When you begin to see the patterns, when you begin to recognize the unconscious dynamics playing out in your relationships, you have a choice. You can try to explain it, to bring others into your new understanding. Sometimes this works, especially with people who are also doing their own inner work. But often it doesn't. Often your attempts to share your insights are experienced as judgment, as superiority, as rejection. And this is because, in a way, you are rejecting something. You're rejecting the old contracts, the old agreements, the old ways of relating. You're not rejecting the person, but they can't feel the difference. The practice here is discernment. Who in your life has the capacity to meet you in your growth? Who is doing their own work? Who can handle your transformation without taking it personally? These are the people to invest in, to open up to share your journey with. Not because they'll understand everything, but because they're willing to grow alongside you, to let the relationship evolve as you evolve. And then there are the people who can't or won't meet you there. This doesn't make them bad people. It just makes them people who are in a different place in their own journey. The practice with these relationships is acceptance without expectation. You can still love them, you can still spend time with them, but you stop expecting them to understand. You stop trying to translate your experience into their language. You meet them where they are, knowing that where they are is no longer where you are, and that's okay. There's also the necessity of finding new community or creating it. This is where the loneliness can begin to transform. You're not alone in going through this process. Millions of people are on the healing journey, feeling the same isolation, struggling with the same sense of being between worlds. The work is to find these people, to build relationships based on mutual growth rather than mutual stagnation. This might mean therapy groups, online communities, retreats, workshops, or simply being open to recognizing fellow travelers when you encounter them in daily life. There's a particular quality of recognition that happens when two people who are both doing deep inner work meet. It's like a secret handshake of the soul. But even with new community, even with fellow travelers, there's still a core of aloneness that can't be eliminated. Because the journey you're on is yours and yours alone. No one else has your exact history, your exact wounds, your exact path toward wholeness. You can share the territory with others, but you still have to walk your own path through it. This is not a loneliness to be fixed. It's a solitude to be embraced. It's the solitude of sovereignty, of self, possession, of standing in your own authority. It's the same solitude that mystics and sages have written about for millennia. It's not empty, it's full of presence, of awareness, of the direct encounter with your own being. And then something shifts. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the loneliness begins to transform into something else. Not connection, not in the conventional sense. Something deeper, a kind of aloneness that feels less like isolation and more like completeness. You stop needing others to validate your experience. You stop needing them to understand your journey. You stop looking for yourself in their eyes. And paradoxically, this is when real connection becomes possible again. You discover that you can be with others without losing yourself. You can love without needing. You can connect without fusing. You can be intimate without abandoning your own center. The relationships that survive your transformation become deeper, more authentic, more real, because they're no longer based on unconscious contracts or mutual projection. They're based on two sovereign individuals choosing to share space while maintaining their own integrity. And new people enter your life, people who are attracted to your authenticity rather than your performance, people who want to know the real you rather than the version you used to pretend to be. These relationships feel different, lighter somehow, even when they're dealing with heavy things. There's less game, playing, less manipulation, less of the exhausting dance of managing each other's emotions and expectations. There's just presence, two people showing up as they actually are. You also discover that the loneliness taught you something essential: how to be your own companion, how to sit with yourself without distraction, how to meet your own needs without depleting yourself trying to get others to meet them, how to find meaning and richness in your own inner life. This isn't narcissism, it's the opposite. It's the development of a strong enough self that you no longer need to consume others to feel whole. The transformation isn't that you stop feeling lonely. It's that you develop a different relationship with loneliness. You recognize it as a teacher, as a guide, as a necessary phase of growth. You stop resisting it. You stop treating it as evidence that something's wrong. You start to see it as evidence that something's right, that you're moving toward authenticity rather than away from it. You notice that you're less reactive. When someone doesn't understand you, you don't collapse into self-doubt or expand into defensiveness. You just accept that they don't understand, and that's okay. You're not here to be understood by everyone. You're here to be real, and sometimes being real means being misunderstood. Sometimes being real means standing alone. And you've learned that you can stand alone without falling apart. There's a particular kind of peace that comes from this. Not the peace of having it all figured out, not the peace of being comfortable, the peace of being aligned, of living in integrity with your own deep knowing, of no longer betraying yourself to maintain false connection, of choosing the discomfort of authentic loneliness over the agony of inauthentic belonging. The integration isn't complete. It never is. You'll still have moments of doubt, moments where you wonder if you've made a terrible mistake, if you've thrown away everything good in pursuit of something that doesn't even exist. But these moments become less frequent and shorter in duration because you've tasted something real. You've touched your own authentic being, And once you've tasted that, you can never fully return to pretending. Remember that question from the beginning. How do you explain to someone that you're not sad, not broken, not in crisis, but waking up? How do you describe the grief of outgrowing your own life? Here's what I've learned: you don't, not really. Not in a way that translates. The loneliness of healing isn't a problem to be solved. It's a passage to be moved through. It's the birth canal of your authentic self. And birth, as anyone who's experienced it knows, is a solitary affair. No matter how many people are in the room with you, you're the only one doing the actual work of bringing something new into being. But here's what makes it bearable: you're not alone in being alone. Every person who has ever dared to become real, to shed the false self, to follow the call toward wholeness, has walked this path. You're part of an invisible lineage of individuals who chose truth over comfort, authenticity over acceptance, becoming over belonging. You can't see them, they can't hold your hand, but they're there, across time and space, a silent chorus of witnesses to your courage. The loneliness of healing is the price of admission to your own life. Not the life you were given, not the life you constructed to please others, but the life that was always yours, waiting beneath the layers of conditioning and fear and adaptation. And yes, it's lonely. Yes, it's hard. Yes, there will be moments when you wonder if it's worth it. But here's what I know: the alternative is worse. The alternative is spending your entire life as a stranger to yourself, surrounded by people who know your name but never meet your soul, performing connection while starving for recognition, playing roles in other people's stories while your own story goes unwritten. That's a loneliness that never transforms. That's an isolation that has no redemption. That's a death that happens while you're still breathing. So if you're in the loneliness of healing right now, if you're standing alone on that shore I described at the beginning, watching the familiar world across water that only you can see, I want you to know something: you're not lost, you're not broken, you're not failing at connection, you're succeeding at transformation. And transformation, real transformation, requires you to stand alone for a while so you can discover that you're strong enough to stand, that you're real enough to be alone without disappearing, that you're whole enough to not need constant validation from others. The journey continues. The loneliness doesn't end so much as it changes shape, becomes something you can carry, something that no longer crushes you but strengthens you. You'll find your people, you'll build new connections, but more importantly, you'll find yourself. And that self, that authentic core that you're excavating from beneath the rubble of your false identities, is worth every moment of loneliness it cost to uncover. The healing journey is lonely, but you are not alone in walking it. And the person you're becoming is worth meeting, worth knowing, worth being. Keep going,